There we go. So, hello.
Hi, Edward.
Nice to see you again. So, the first thing is just can you say your name and where you are?
My name is Wiltrud Krauss-Kogan, and I'm living in Frankfurt, Germany, where I also work most of the time.
Okay. And the first question is who are you as a person? Who are you as a human being? And that can be your passions, your values, qualities about yourself, or whatever you'd like.
Very good question. I would have thought you would start with that. Okay. It's always a bit difficult to start with self-promoting or self-describing could be that. Okay, maybe I do it that way, how I started in life. I was given the name Wiltrud. Even I have a second name still that's called Leah. And Leah was the name of the second name of my grandmother. It was also not her first name. So anyway, but I was called Wiltrud, which I felt in my childhood often a curse because it means willpower. And my mother told me the first moment I came into this world, I was stubbornly crying. And that willfulness, which seemed to have been projected on me from the first minute, of course, is a bit of a guiding principle in my life. And you remember when we talked about Laura, I said what impressed me so much was the permission to go to the boundary in each situation and life circumstance. And actually, I am such a person. I can let go of things, but I first have to explore where the resistance is. So I think with that kind of curse on me, I mean, often I was challenged on that. My parents always wanted to break that will when I was a kid. I had a very early on sense of dignity, which was at the time not attributed to kids. And so when I came to school and learned that the first paragraph of our constitution says the human dignity is inviolable, that meant a tremendous amount to me. But of course, it was not yet realized too much in the society, but at least it was a right. And so you could say this guided me in my search for anything. As for example, I always wanted as a child to have that extended to animals as well, because I saw so much torture of animals living on the countryside and seeing how animals got killed for food. And these were often beings which I and I felt always it was the most utter betrayal. So I'm still engaged nowadays as on the side, so to speak, when I'm not dealing with human beings in, how can I say, in organizations like PETA, to deal with making animal conditions on this world a bit better. So I find also that this should be part of the Constitution. The dignity of all beings is inviolable, but then it gets a bit more hard to eat them and wear shoes from them.
Yes, that makes it a little more difficult.
Yes, but the thing is, once you develop, and this goes very much into how I am as a therapist as well. What I am aware of, I can sometimes put brackets around and choose not to focus on it, but I never lose it. The same is as I grew up, I was very early on confronted with German history, the immediate history which went before me. and that was the Second World War and the accompanying Holocaust. So knowing this, I was, I think, 12 when I first learned about it. I could never leave this awareness. Any older German I encounter as I was a kid, but I looked at grown-ups, were you one of them? And I was always growing up with that sense of danger in his own country. And until today, I mean, that guided me through my whole adolescent youth, as a young adult time. I was part of the political movement in the 70s, already a bit influenced in the 60s by a high school teacher who was left-wing and was in our small town because he was not behaving too well. So that went all into that. And my search for finding, how can you say, a theory, a guiding life philosophy, which included this foundational principle of the dignity of the human being is inviolable. So during my studies in Frankfurt, the student movement was in many ways enlightening, but not necessarily accompanied by this principle. These were very patriarchic and authoritarian structures most of these rebels had within them. I wrote in an article where women in Gestalt therapy, a bit more of their time. And a lot at that time was very authoritarian. And women had mainly the function of being the distributors of political flyers or the love rabbit for the leader. Much more place was not for women. So all my search for belonging in a political environment, I had to always leave part of myself outside. The same happened then in the university with, I studied psychology, education, and sociology. And the dominant—
a very dangerous combination.
Yeah, it was, I mean, that of course was much more civilized, but it was interesting, and it was very infiltrated by left-wing thought at the time in Marxism. You could not write a paper without the word Marxistic viewpoint of this is, and so on. But it was also a kind of authoritarian character in it, even though they claimed to work against it. So part of my studies, especially in the Department of Sociology, they were the most progressive because they were very influenced by the German School of Critical Theory with Adorno and Horkheimer, maybe you heard, and Mabuse, which later went to the United States. So that influenced me, but it was still very intellectual and with acrobatic sentences you cannot believe. Adorno wrote sometimes a sentence over 2 pages. So it was not very applicable. And at some point I realized that I needed more, something which would help me to be from inside more as a stronger in the feel. I came from the countryside. I was a country bumpkin, and here I'm in this big city full of this uproar on the political side. And in the other psychological disciplines at the time I studied, which was psychoanalysis, and that all our whole studies was based on psychoanalysis, and behavior therapy was at the time also around. But that was again too dogmatic for me and rigid. So, and even the psychoanalysis had a very strong attitude towards people with, we have the right to determine what is wrong with you. So that didn't fit with my principle of the dignity of the human being is inviolable. And early on in my time coming to Frankfurt, when I was 18, I met traveling with a backpack around in the world that was very in at the time, a guy from America, from California. He was smoking hashish and he was left-wing. He belonged to the human potential movement and also power flower movement. And when we departed, we met somewhere on the trip, and then we had lots of discussion, and we met again in another city, and then at the end, before he went back to the States, he wrote me a so-called poem he said was the banner of the human potential movement. But he didn't know who wrote it. And it was called I Am I and You Are You. And you know the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I was extremely impressed by that. It expressed a freedom I was not raised in and I wouldn't see any place. Also, even though it was later on got a lot of bashing, it seemed still respectful of each other's freedom, integrity, etc. So this became my new guideline. Or I added it to the dignity of the human being is inviolable. And then later on, when I met Laura, I learned, of course, that she found it as an adolescent. And many criticized it as too individualistic. But I came across an interview with Krauss-Kogan, and she was criticizing Fritz for this, and he answered, well, of course, only there was 2 lines missing I would now add, he said. And that is, I and you are the foundation to we, and only together we can change the world. That was,
it was supposed to be relational.
It was supposed to be relational. And that was a bit more the insight he gained when he wanted to go to Lake Cowichan to have kibbutz for Gestalt therapy, like a learning community. He started to become more community oriented. And that that in a way made me again like the poem after it was a bit spoiled for me. And I like actually more the word poem for it, as I was originally introduced to it, and not Gestalt prayer.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, less dogmatic.
Yes. And I wrote actually once a little article, but only in German, about this poem, so to speak, and what a contradictory heritage that was from the Pearls to give to us, where then the West Coast against the East Coast, and in Germany the West Coast was also attacked. But in reality, my experience was totally different. That the West Coast, a lot of people I met there were wonderful and very open-minded, very respectful and dialogic. So it had nothing to do with this 10 times I and after me.
Yeah, it's a myth of division to some extent. So
Yes.
before we get more into the Gestalt part, I do want to ask you a couple questions about yourself.
Oh, there was a lot about me.
That was about you, but it's going to a different part.
Mhm.
I love that your mug matches your scarf. That's beautiful. um, so I'm wondering how you experience yourself within your gender or as a woman.
How do I experience myself?
Or how have you come to understand yourself?
That was a journey too, because I grew up in a family which claimed not to make a big difference between my brother and me, but started after dinner. I had to take the dishes out, and he was liberated from that task. And when I wanted to play piano, and we didn't have much money when I grew up, it was said he was more musicalic than me. He gets the piano lessons, and I was left out. So again came my will in. Then I want at least something too. And at that time, it was riding horses. It wasn't cheaper than piano lessons. And I didn't really get the single um, horse riding lessons because that they couldn't afford, but at least I did what was called voltigieren on a lasso with the horse. And we were a group of kids and we had to jump on the horse and make different artistic things. That was much cheaper and it still was for me very wonderful.
Hmm.
But my mother was also not a good example. She was a teacher, but my father didn't want her to work because what could people in the village think if his wife had to work? So my mother tended to be always, as for me, and I had a difficult relationship with her because she was fearful. And in her fear, she limited me a lot. Pay attention. Here's danger. Here's danger. And thank God I had an aunt. She was my godmother, that was the sister of my father. She was not married. She was a professional single woman. And she had self-confidence. She did what she wanted. She was not fearful. She was always kind of, she would always see the solution rather than the problem. And so she had a big influence on me. As it was a correcting influence. Later on, I did respect my mother more. I'm not sure I told you that story that I'm not sure in what context I would have told you that, but that's a later story. I made up with her. I saw what she could give me. But as a kid, I was rejecting a lot of that because it didn't help me to become the woman I wanted to be.
Hmm.
So I took more from my aunt. And as a child, because of that, I wanted more to be a boy because it seemed to give me more rights. Later on, I did actually like that I was a girl and a woman. And of course, I like to flirt and all of these things. But I had always a strong sense nobody tells me what to do. So in that way, I identified, by the way, with Fritz Perls.
Hmm.
But this approach, nobody tells me what to do, was more internal. It was not something I always allowed myself. So that's how I got later in therapy to learn more about that.
Hmm.
And Cindy played another big role. She was my first trainer I was exposed to. And internally, I adopted her for quite a while before she became like a trainer, supervisor, colleague, and then eventually a friend. Yeah. So I did this. Actually, she had this idea once that she said, well, you can always temporarily adopt somebody until you found in yourself what you wanted to have. And then you can divorce again.
Well, that actually is another question. I mean, who comes to mind as one of the most significant people that you've met in your life?
Also, in terms of women, I said already it was Cindy,
Mm-hmm.
my aunt. Another female who had a big influence on me was actually a healer. I'm not sure you heard of her. Her name is Rosalind Briere.
Yeah.
She's she is a complex healer, lives in Los Angeles, also trained, by the way, as a Gestalt therapist. And she was also a very influential teacher on Jim Kepner. We both had about the same amount of training with her, over 10 years. And she was a very strong woman, as she still is. She's still alive. And she had something, she was very strong, but she has learned something which she got from the Navajos. Before you graduate as a Navajo kid and get initiated into the tribe as a grown-up, you have
Oh, I missed the secret. You have to what? You froze.
you have to learn how to speak the truth beautifully,
Hmm.
meaning you shall, I mean, in this first Gestalt movements, people sometimes hit the truth with a hammer on your head, and they thought it's justified because it's my truth, so it has to be true. And she thought that was cruel and unkind. Um, so you would ask yourself, is it necessary? What do I want to achieve? And speaking the truth beautifully is basically the art of reframing. So you look, before you maybe attack somebody, you look what intentionality might be on the other side, and maybe speak more to that than to how things came across. This differentiation, basically, it's a differentiation process. And I didn't know that until then. I knew nobody who could do that. And I think knowing her has really made me into a better Gestalt therapist.
Hmm.
I used to be, in my emancipation process as a woman, also temporarily quite rude, because that was the thing to be at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, radical and reactive is not always
Yes,
very
yeah,
kind.
impulsive, radical, reactive,
Yeah.
right.
Hmm. Okay.
And the way, even in Gestalt therapy, to somehow stop somebody who was like that, it was still a moral way.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were a bad person when you did that, but there was not really as a, so you felt guilty when you were
Mm-hmm.
called on that. While in this approach from Rosalind, it was simply shown that you haven't really accomplished the art of letting the other exist in yourself and still go in a dialogue and address a few things you might not like or do differently. So that was a very helpful training in my life.
Hmm.
changed my viewpoint, and it had more to do with dignity.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how it comes back to that, huh? So I'm also wondering a different thing about you, which is how you are experiencing and understanding age at this point in your life.
Well, How do I understand age? I'm now 67. um, Actually, if I'm not looking in the mirror, I could forget it sometimes. I'm still quite sportive. I live in the fourth floor, 85 steps high. I think I mentioned that last time in the talk about Laura. So I bicycle, I walk, I hike. So, and I'm often together with young people. That's part of my work. I work with adolescents a lot. That I forget, at least in the contact. I mean, I know I'm more the grandma for those kids. um, and I'm sometimes called, well, for grandma, you're cool, which is a nice flattering. However, I wouldn't want to be younger again. Let me put it that way. Because I don't want to be as searching and insecure as I was in younger years. Even I had less wrinkles and looked maybe a bit more attractive, but as it's some of that, I'm a much more balanced and happy and humorous person as an older woman than I was as a young woman. Things were much more tragic in my younger years.
Hmm.
So,
Interesting.
so I like that part of age. Now, I'm not romanticized about it. Um, I mean, I do a lot of witnessing, or have witnessed how it is to age and also decay. I must put it that way. My husband died from a very bad disease, or had a series of diseases before he died. And so I could witness that physical uh, departure of the body. And that's not romantic. It's not necessarily nice. What was not, what was good to see is, despite that, it's not a reason to be desperate. For example, I would say, in case of my husband, in the most ill phases of his life, he was not a grumpy, mean guy. In fact, I had an image of him becoming much more complete. He used to, as a younger man, he was sometimes kind of a bit choleric. Also not often, but at times he had these choleric outbreaks, and like everything had to go, like, what if he wanted something, he wanted it immediately and went on my and as he was aging and becoming even ill, he was so kind, he was so understanding, and he in a way ripened into a compassionate love I have only seen in moments and imagined often in him, but not always had in everyday life, as a lot, but not always. And so for me, it was like the personality as a parallel to the physical disappearance or decay. Is that the right word? Came a kind
Decline,
of
I think.
decline. That's the word. I saw decay is not quite the right thing. You say that about your teeth.
I mean, it's true. Organically, we start falling apart, right? That's
Yes. But I didn't find that word decline in the
yeah.
moment. So anyway, as a parallel to that, it seemed like from inside he got bigger and just a wonderful human being. So I feel and he showed me how to die. He really taught me how to die. And that was I'm forever thankful for that. I mean, my dying process might be different, but it took away my fear of dying. Even if I would make a photo of that, he didn't look gorgeous then, physically. But what came from him, from inside, outside emanating, was wonderful. So aging, I'm not so afraid of that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm sorry and I'm glad that you had that
uh,
experience.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Actually, you never know why things happen the way they do. Maybe that was his last teaching in my life.
Maybe, maybe.
Yeah.
Hmm. So another aspect, before I get into the more Gestalty aspects, although this is all very also related, I'm wondering how you have come to experience and understand power and privilege in your life.
Power and privilege. As a power, I have basically first encountered as in the form of abuse of power. Then I knew somebody was using power, and sometimes against me or others, or to animals, as I've described. Um, a positive um, idea of use of power I have come to see in people I admired, who were role models. They didn't exercise that power not over others, but it was a kind. Uh, the power would go along with the word integrity. Um, it was a self-reliance. It was an exercise of serenity, of respect. It all goes with that word power. And what was the other word?
Privilege.
Oh, privilege. Well, um, again, through the polarity, early on in my life, I encountered in my school uh, that rich people seem to have more privilege. It came already when I was a kid. Kids were dressed differently. Nowadays it's horrible. I mean, how much power rich kids have in a class and how bossy they can be. But already then there was a certain way of dressing. You could immediately identify they came from rich families. And I could see how teachers reacted differently to kids who were well dressed. Now, I didn't think I looked so awful, but we had not much money. And my mother used to make me dresses from old curtains, for example. She did her very best to make them nice and fashionable, but still, maybe nobody else saw it. I just knew. I was not unhappy about this because I liked them. However, sometimes I could see the looks. So this is privilege and non-privilege. I could not quite study every place and everything because my parents didn't have enough money for everything. um, Yet, and then there was a kind of, in my family, a kind of romanticization going on of that you are more noble person if you don't have money. And I had to learn over time to get a bit rid of that in me. Otherwise, I cause a self-fulfilling prophecy. Urge of creative adaptation due to not enough money. Yeah. So with the privilege, yet compared to again other kids, I was privileged. My parents were educated people. They didn't earn much, as I said, my mother was a teacher, my father too. But that was in the after-war Germany, and teachers on the countryside were sometimes, even in the beginning years, partly paid in naturalistic ways. Also, they get from the
Eggs and
community
milk.
eggs and bread and cheese and ham. As of course, later their income got much better, but it was always a bit of a, yeah. On the other hand, I was privileged because I was as a I was not really beaten a lot. I was beaten, but not a lot. While some of the kids
An
I met,
odd way to describe privilege. The privilege of being beaten less than others.
yes, yes, or I had more access to books, to education, to my parents belonged to the Social Democrats. I had a bit more different input into how I viewed politics and early on. So all of that I consider kind of privilege. Um, in terms of what now the discussion is often in the Gestalt community, and which peaked to some absurdity a few years ago in Toronto, the Gestalt therapists would all get up um, and say, as a from America often, as the Americans started that. I'm a white, privileged supremacist, and I am so sorry. And this was a response to people who were sharing their feeling not privileged, or they felt they were people of color, or there would be microaggressions towards them. And then came this people standing up. I'm so sorry. I'm a white, privileged supremacist. And I thought, what a stupid thing is that? I'm sorry to say, but first of all, it didn't address what they came with. You don't have to be sorry because you're white. I mean, you're born that way. But you could just listen to what they had to say without see. My generation also grew up with continuously feeling, I'm a German of non-Jewish descent.
Mhm.
I'm so sorry. The Jews in my life I met, and especially when I spent some time in Israel, didn't want to be apologized for that I am who I am. They wanted to be seen and heard. And actually, spending some time in Israel for several years taught me very much to own that I'm a German, which I disowned before. And by the time I owned it, I found out I am partly of Jewish descent, but I didn't know that until I was in my mid 40s. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you say comes back to privilege and power, because it's not just being sorry, it's saying, okay, this is what I was born into, and what
Yes.
do I choose to do from where
Yes.
I am?
Yes. And with privilege, I do believe there is a certain necessity to be aware of that, and also share something when you have a privilege to share. In Jewish culture, there is this thing, it's called tikkun ha'olam, meaning making, it's almost like a working model for being in this world. You contribute a little bit more to the betterness of the world. Everybody does it every year, and there's even a day for that called a mitzvah day. And I was a bit grown up that way. Also, that when we had something extra, we give a bit from that what we have to somebody else.
Hmm.
Yeah, like my father would give all this how do you say, lessons to kids who were refugees or immigrants, and they had trouble with German. So he gave those for free. He didn't ask for money.
Yeah, sort of an altruistic kind of principle.
Yeah, also he didn't think about that. He simply said that's necessary and nobody gives that, so we do it. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned a little while ago a bit about finding this poem and how that brought you into Gestalt a little bit. I'm wondering what the rest of that story is. I mean, how you came into Gestalt and what you found there.
Well, as I said, the first encounter was unconscious because I didn't know that this poem was Gestalt. Um, I then continued to search for this attitude again about what I experienced as dignity. For example, I went during the years in university, I didn't find dignity expressed in psychoanalysis at the time, the way it was practiced, and also with this attitude of that they know everything better than the client. I didn't like it in the conditioning of the behavior therapists. Then what else did I do? Primal scream. And then I didn't like that. That was just like a total opposite of everything. And it was violent sometimes. And I thought, no way. Also, that's not for me. Then what else was around at that time? Family therapy. I liked that a lot. That was a humanistic approach already then with Virginia Satir and Karl Whittaker and others. And then let's see what else was around. Rogerian therapy. And that's how I got into Gestalt therapy. A professor in the university wrote out a design where students could voluntarily come and get 30 hours of free therapy if they would write the interview, make a transcript of the interview. And he did a study with that. Within the 30 hours of Rogerian therapy, he packed 1 hour.
Es ist 3 Uhr abends.
Okay, that was my computer. He packed 1 hour of Gestalt therapy. And we were supposed to evaluate each hour afterwards. And it was not difficult for me to find which one was Gestalt. It was the only hour where something happened. All the others, the Rogerian therapists are very, very kind, but they are boring as hell, in my view, because they always mirror what you just said. Oh, and you mean that you just said this? Did I get you right?
And so you mean that Rogerians are boring?
Sorry, they were friendly. They were very nice and friendly and respectful. But there was not a discourse. It was not dialogue. It was not a challenge. And I looked for what we say in German, Gegenüber. That Martin Buber speaks a lot of that. A Gegenüber, look, here am I and here's the other person. And we meet and we feel where each other's boundary is. Also, not always physically, but in our dialogue. And the Rogerians are like that. As I talk, and they are like cotton nice. And a Gestalt therapist would do some selective self-revelation. They wouldn't always say everything, but as much as was necessary, Laura used to say, for getting to the next step in the therapy session. And so you can have a real mensch-to-mensch encounter. And so this is how once I found out which one was the Gestalt session. It was later on confirmed that was the session. And then I discover in the office of this professor again that poem. So I asked him, "Oh, you have that poem. Who is this from?" And he said, "Well, that's from a man named Fritz Perls." And then I knew I wanted to know, where can I get more of that? I was very surprised to hear that it had anything to do with psychotherapy. So I looked where I can get Gestalt therapy. And there was one institute at the time in Germany. There was not much around yet. I think altogether 2 institutes, and one which was considered the biggest one, I went to. And in the selection process for becoming a trainee, they engaged 2 people from the United States to do that. And guess who it was? Cindy and my husband. Also, he was not my husband, and I didn't know him. And that actually was the only time he was ever a trainer in my life. Because later on, it took another 1.5 years before we became connected. But then I made sure I would never be in any kind of teaching context with him. Yeah, and Cindy. And in that institute, I'm not gonna name it now and no people, the German Gestalt therapists that was already much better than the psychoanalysis, but it was still a very German interpretation of what I think is Gestalt. Any Gestalt principle was encountered in a dogmatic way, in a rigid way, as if it's a rule. So I heard often with this pointed finger, take responsibility, be aware, or whatever. And I didn't like that. The righteousness and the bossiness about it. Especially learning later that they were not so well trained in Gestalt therapy anyway. So when I saw Cindy and Jerry working, I wanted to know, oh, where is that? So it was clear it was from San Francisco. And I had a new goal. I'm going to go there. At the time, I was working as a counselor in an institution for kids who had a lot of trouble. And I worked there for about 2 years. And then I decided I apply for the German Academic Exchange Service to get a stipend for studying in the States. Now, I never quite fulfilled all what they later on wanted from me, but I wrote the expose for a dissertation, and it included family therapy and Gestalt therapy, and I was supposed to make the merging of both. So I got paid for the California Graduate School for Marital and Family Therapy, and paralleled the tuition for the Gestalt Institute San Francisco for 1 year. And I went then to America. And I lived in a community with 5 people. We shared a house, and it was the mecca of everything which had to do with personal growth and human potential. And I was so happy. There, this 19, when I was 18 and saw this poem, I suddenly was middle in this place where everything started. So these were good years in my life.
Mm-hmm. I love the expression on your face when you...
Yeah, it was really good. Sometimes I don't nowadays know anymore when I did all the things I did, because I did work then also in a clinic in San Francisco for drug addicts on Haight-Ashbury in Walden House. and I did some work for this Institute of Family Therapy. They also wanted transcripts of sessions they did with other people for JFK University. So I would, and the payoff was I would get additional training hours if I would do that work. And I did that. And sometime, oh, and then I cleaned in Marianne's guest house, across from UC Berkeley, UC San Francisco, in order to earn money to finance my second year, because the German institution only paid for 1 year, and I ended up staying 3 years. So I cleaned the institute, I painted the institute, I renovated it, I sewed about 50 pillows to be beaten on. I made exchanges for people in their clothes. Somebody gave me a sewing machine. I sat in the garden with an extension course because I couldn't miss one sun ray coming from dark Germany. And I did in the afternoons my sewing for people, alterations, and all saving money for my next time, in the institute or for my individual sessions, training sessions. And yeah, it was great.
And what did you find, and what did you do with it? I mean, I know that there is a huge list. I have some idea who I'm talking to here, but I'm just wondering what for you is the essence of what you found and of the work that you did?
As a number one, I really enjoyed this atmosphere there. They had a kind of community of trainers. It was not one figure. We got exposed to a lot of different trainers. That was their teaching model, their training model. It was a community of trainers. They decided things on a board equally. They alternated being president. It was not always the same person. The women were very much into women's liberation. Women who were self-confident. I found them basically kind, respectful, and especially humorous. I was just so hungry for that, coming from that serious Germany. And what was important? There were two people in that institute who did something what was called social Gestalt. They worked in projects bringing Gestalt therapy in the local community. It had all to do with emancipation and enabling and how was it called? Empowerment. By the way, when this discussion was again that no Gestalt, there were no Black Gestalt therapists in the Gestalt community, in my group were two. So San Francisco was very early on reaching out, or people came. There were quite a few Mexicans in it. There were people from all the world in it. It was actually quite international. So that was good. And for me, a model for how we later on conducted our training institute. They were more body oriented, not so cognitively like some other institutes. As maybe some other institutes like LA did more theory development, which they did very well. They also they were specialists on dialogue, I would say. They were quite good in that.
That's funny. I'm actually talking with Lynn and Gary this afternoon.
Yeah, actually, Lynn and Gary played a big role too, because both of them worked for us as guest trainers in our institute in Germany. for several years. And from Lynn, I also learned how to appreciate diagnostic.
Mhm.
She did a great job with that.
Mhm. And that's the other part that I'm curious about is what have you developed in your own work? I mean, where have you taken what you got?
Yeah, I mean, my work is basically very dialogical. That's my main attitude to life, even to plants. I talk to my plants or to animals, as I said. They are very able to do that. To kids, I will be talking in May in a conference for child therapists, and I will speak about how dialogue with children has a healing effect. You don't have to always speak in a kind of grown-up condescending way to kiddies or make them small, but rather how you can meet them. Yeah. Tell me who you are. I tell you how I am. You can do with a lot of kids early on. So that's one thing. Diagnostic is a big one because I have to make quick diagnosis. I think Lynn very much sharpened my awareness for processes, structural processes in people. Cindy, Jim Kepner, and this other woman who is a Gestalt therapist but not a trainer, this Rosalind Briere, sharpened all my awareness on body and body processes. Cindy, in addition, also on group process. And actually, I'm always getting invited into training groups for having to specially work with the group because some of the others don't like to do that so much. So early on, the article from Elaine Kepner on group process was quite useful for me. There's meanwhile much more about that. But Peter Cole, you know him, he is big on group process as well, and Cindy was one of his main teachers. So in addition, there's of course Bud Feather. I met him also during my time, but on a conference, not as a trainer. On the first West Coast Gestalt Trainers Conference in La Jolla, I think it was. So as my focus is always field oriented or figure, always to give this figure ground, going forth and back between the ground and the figure, and always look for the background of everything. That's even possible to bring into the work with children. Or I have worked with one kid who was himself coming from a mixed cultural background and was exposed to mobbing. And then he identified with the white, privileged, not suprematist few, but you know, the white privileged kids, with the white side of his family, and in a way denied the other part of himself, and betrayed even his mother, who was from Brazil. And at one point, when we went through that, I was asking him, you know, you sometimes have to ask yourself in what kind of world you want to live, and take a stance. So what would be a stance, for example, to his grandparents who adored who were the parents of the father of the kid, but they rejected the mother. And he was still working on that with me for quite a while, of how to own his full self. And then at one point he was witnessing again how the grandparents were with his mother. And he said to Grandma, I want you to know I'm not coming back to you if you do this again ever to my mother. So he started to own it, and he also started to own it in school. And this in the age of 11. So that's not bad.
No, that sounds like a good start.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I've
So
noticed,
that's
I
a
mean,
way of working. So you wanted to know how I transform that. This is
Mhm.
a bit where I personally I consider, and Laura also sees Gestalt therapy as such, I consider myself a political person, always. So I never leave this just out, and this is just a disturbance. Mm.
That makes sense. So I am also wondering, I know that you're being very humble. You've done a lot of things within Gestalt in terms of teachings and trainings and working and establishing. I've heard about you. Um, so I'm wondering what you identify as some challenges that you have run up against in different aspects of your work.
Um, yeah, just the other day I had such a challenge. While well, I have a broad spectrum of people I can work with, truly over the years. I just came to, and I was really shamed to realize that I have done that. I had a kid the other day, just 2 weeks ago, who I was a bit tired, and there came one of these teenagers who was a chronic suicidal person. She was already 4 times or 5 times in the age of 13 in the psychiatry, and lived away from home in some kind of foster context. And she was telling me of her last suicide, hanging herself on a tree. And while she was behaved a bit like, I might do this again. I was just accidentally caught. And while I appreciated that some extreme things must have happened in her life to come to such a conclusion of what to do about her life, she seemed to have a poker face and was almost a bit bragging, almost. I mean, indeed, I later on found out there was quite some traumatic stuff in her life. And of course, I should have known that. And I know that also generally. And then I asked her just to find out, could I work with that kid? I often ask whether they also believe in something, to see, is there support from, what kind of support is there as in the background? And then she said, no, I'm an atheist. And then she wanted to know whether I believe in something, or yeah, or if what it is. And I didn't come with God, but I said, I believe in life and consider it sacred. And then I could see she closed up. It was a bit towards the end of the session. And she wrote me an email to say she decided not to work with me. And in some way, I felt relief because I thought in my old age, I don't need a constant acting out teenager who wants to kill herself with every little challenge there is in life. That was one part of me. I mean, because you have to be very engaged, and it's almost like you run against a power which is so strong. And in all my free times to get emergency calls. But I felt also suddenly understanding why she did that. And I thought it was a stupid answer from me when she asked me what I believe. I should have held back with that because I shamed her with it. When I said so strongly, I believe in life and that consider life sacred, it was implicit a statement about her not believing in life. And so putting myself in her shoes, I might also not have chosen that therapist who would value my life as not so valuable. And implicit, that was in a way a statement.
It's true. I mean, I come up against that a lot, and I always say that I'm a mortalist, and for me, death is okay.
Ah,
I don't think I would go so far as to, encourage suicide,
uh-huh.
but I can understand ending life as an option.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I was too much on the side of trying to gain her back into life. I thought I could make her a bit curious about life. But the opposite happened. Even though I wanted to find out how was that for her, she did not want to engage too much in that anymore. She said simply, I'm different. So I realized I worked with quite a few suicidal ones and it worked and they went back into life. But it was not such a total desperate chronic one as this one, who waits only for the next chance she gets. And I should have remained on the level of seeing the underlying desperation and tiredness of life.
That's interesting. I mean, that's the most difficult example of being able to work without an agenda. I mean, not even the agenda of keeping your client alive.
Yes.
That is difficult.
Yeah. So, also she taught me a lot, but I felt really, really sorry. So I wished her that she finds somebody fitting for her. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a challenge for sure. And I'm wondering, on the other side, I know we have two other conversations, one about Laura and one about Jerry.
Yeah.
But what comes to mind now as one of those or some of those moments that you have felt fulfilled, or some of those highlights or greatest memories within your Gestalt life?
Greatest memory of my Gestalt life. Oh God. Many
It's
great
obviously a figure ground question.
figure
Just
ground.
whatever pops up.
I find that hard to pick one out because I find there were many wonderful moments and ahas, I told you about those moments where I felt that Gestalt therapy is in essence valuing life and differentness, where that was always wonderful. Maybe some of my happiest moments were in some of the summer trainings we did or international trainings, because there we often combined duty with joy, meaning we held those long trainings of 2 weeks in beautiful places. Like we did many trainings in France and in an old medieval chateau, or on a beautiful, healthy, beautiful river near the ocean. Or in India, we did one in an Ayurvedic retreat directly above the ocean. And actually, these international programs I found most satisfying. It were two weeks programs, and Kailash is one of them who was participating in those for several years, and getting all these different people from different places together Also, our training staff was usually, we had several people who participated in it. For example, Cindy was for many years part of these intensive summer programs, or Jaro Starak came sometimes. We had sometimes Joy Latner. We had sometimes, who else came? I said Gary came sometimes. We had always somebody, and somebody who was for many, many years very loyal genie trainer was Ernest Mccoy. I don't know whether you know him.
I'll be meeting him soon.
You do?
I will meet him. I haven't met him.
Oh, I love Ernest and give him my regards. He should be now around 85, I think. Yeah. Yeah, he was for many years accompanying us. He also died already. Tom Lane. So and Milan Šreković. Milan Šreković was also mainly trained by Laura, and he lives in the south of France and is actually in former Yugoslavia. And Milan was a genie trainer for, I think, around 10 years before he moved to France. So it was always a lot of fun having these communities of trainers and then being in the communities of our trainees, which we always did that everybody worked with everybody. We had 3 levels usually, the supervisory level, the intermediate level, the beginning level, and then we not only had them parallel, like in some other training programs I know, but we had them all doing different works with each other, and these supervision levels supervised the intermediates and the beginning level, and the intermediate supervised the beginning level, so they would also learn how to be supervisors. And we had a lot of social fun too in the evening. We sang and we danced, and it was very nice. So
When people could get together.
yes, that was some of my happiest moments. Yeah.
So I am wondering what is next for you and what you think is next for Gestalt from where we are right now.
Yeah, there is. I know 1 or 2 people are doing this already. Anne Leibig from the North Carolina Institute, dealing more with aging and dying, facing that. Even we stay in the here and now, but they're bringing the there and then into the here and now of aging and dying people, I think can be very, very useful. And going sometimes along with that is including also the realm of spirituality. Because in Germany, I got with some people very attacked by doing that. I was even on a conference in Switzerland where I was on a panel with different ones, and I was attacked that this is mambo jumbo and it would be in the way of Gestalt therapy being recognized, politically recognized for the health insurances. And I think that's total baloney because even psychoanalysis has discovered spirituality in the meantime, quite 1 or 2 years before us. And the medical association where we belong to as practicing therapists had just issued in that very year where I was on the panel an article saying most therapists are not sufficiently knowledgeable in this realm. And we have all these different clients. For example, we have in Germany now many Muslims. We have people with Buddhistic backgrounds. We have people with from Zarathustra, from Iran, and God knows what the spiritual background is. And if we have no notion about that or no resonance to that, I think we cannot accompany people too well.
It's a part of the person, right?
Exactly. And it's not mambo jumbo. And also to understand that as both a resource as well as maybe for people being a sacred realm. So for me, that at least has been almost always a very important part of my life. But in my political days, I never dared to speak about it. So, and I asked once Laura about it, and she said since she was in her 20s, reading Suzuki and Buddhism and practicing it. And I said, why did you never speak about it? And she said, well, in those days and right after the war, that was a luxury. We had other things to deal with than spirituality, which became a more fed kind of things in the later on to be human potential movement and beyond in the 80s, 90s.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a luxury or a necessity after
Well, she
those
claimed
kinds of
it.
experiences in life.
I think she feared, I'm not sure she didn't admit that, but the New York Institute was always very left-wing rational. And I heard never anybody speaking about spirituality. In fact, actually, I think I had a discussion on the last conference with Dan. Did you ever realize that Martin Buber was an extremely spiritual person? And we only deal with the dialogue part of his heritage, but never with what he was gaining from his spiritual quest. So yeah, he's mainly known in Germany outside of psychotherapy. He's mainly known for his spiritual contributions as a Hasidim. I think is another thing for Gestalt therapy to more allow into the into Gestalt therapy because it's implicit there.
So is this what's next for you? Is it what's next for Gestalt, or is it both?
Also, with me, it's already quite a while, and I got a lot of support from Cindy in this regard, because she is, since I know her 40 years ago, pretty much involved in such endeavors. But I think in the broader realm, as a Cindy, for example, I would know a lot about that about Cindy, but she wouldn't always talk about that in Gestalt contexts, because that was still not considered so. It was seen as evasiveness, or how can I say? Fritz Perls said always he wants to create a theory which is independent of all the isms, meaning also of all the religions. And he criticized the existentialists of still having isms, like Buber had Judaism, and Sartre had again communistic ism, and so on. So his students who were loyal would hide that part that they might be into spiritualisms.
That's interesting. So no more hidden parts.
No more hidden part. No. Yeah.
Well, I am running out of questions, but I don't feel like I'm finished talking to you because I know we have another conversation. But I'm wondering if there's anything else that you would like to add to this part of our conversation today.
Anything else? Well, I would say I don't think, even though we are aiming for Gestalt therapy to become a recognized therapy by the state, it's not just a psychotherapy approach, which you can do learn just basically cognitively. I mean, you can do theory sessions online, but basically even some personal encounters like we have now. but it's very much something you need to experience. And where did I want to go with that? Oh, and it's a way of life. That's what I wanted to say. It's definitely for me a life-orienting philosophy. It's for me even an extension of a democratic viewpoint of life, as to society. In fact, it could be included in the Constitution. but it's a way of life and how I view life. It corresponds to so many modern discoveries of the interconnectedness of everything, of biology, of creative adaptation is a concept which existed years in biology. In brain research, we find that, and all of that. So it's really very comprehensive, much more than we realize originally.
Yeah, I agree. So is there any other thing about you, or should we leave that for another day?
I have usually, even I see many terrible things happening in the world right now. I tend to be optimistic, but I think we need to be awake and aware in order for that optimism taking more space in society and the world. As we can't be the bystanders with terrible things. I think we need to engage in what's going on in the world, even if it's unpopular sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you. Is it okay if we leave this here for now?
Mm-hmm.